I do believe that in order to transition, you need to make a decision. The most challenging aspect of being in these circumstances is not being able to make a choice, being so afraid of the unknown that on the one hand, you're terrified of what's ahead, but on the other hand, you're holding on to what the past was.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi, and I'm your host here. I'm the president of Dena Project Management, a construction and project management firm that helps real estate developers define, design, and deliver successful projects. My guest for this episode is Mazyar Mortazavi. He is the president and CEO of TAS Impact. TAS Impact is a Toronto-based real estate development and investment firm that uses real estate as a tool to deliver both profit and purpose. We're going to talk about that in this episode. It focuses on mixed-use ground-up development, managing private equity vehicles, and tackling climate change, affordability, and social connection. Mazyar is the president and CEO of this company. He is a family-owned business which started back in the 1980s. It basically went from being a custom home builder to a significantly larger entity that is operating under TAS these days. We're going to explore that trend and journey together in this episode with him. He is recognized as a thought leader when it comes to all items impact and real estate investment and real estate development. He is the chair of the Bentway Conservancy and the trustee of Art Gallery of Ontario. He holds an undergraduate in environmental studies and graduate degree in architecture from University of Waterloo. As always, you can find more information about our guest and this episode on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Please help us grow the show by pushing that subscribe button, and even better, tell others about it and get the word out there, and that way you can seriously support us. As always, thank you very much. We're very happy to have you here and enjoy listening. Hello, Mazyar. Thank you for being here today.
Great, it's a pleasure.
I very much appreciate your time and you being here. This has been one of our targets to get you on this show this year. I want to explore a couple of tracks in this episode with you, hopefully here. When you and I were having an offline chat, you asked me what is the purpose of this exercise, of this podcast and this episode. And I came up with these two goals. And one is to document your path as an entrepreneur, as a developer from your family. I've obviously done a little bit of homework. I know where the company started, and also talk about the future and the current situation and the impact that is incorporated into the name of the company. Mm-hmm. But before we dig too deep into those things, why don't we go ahead and ask you to introduce yourself to our audience who might not be familiar with your work, and then we go from there.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, Pam. It's a pleasure to be here. Mazyar Mortazavi. I'm the president and CEO of TAS. We are a real estate company that is based in Toronto. And we've been operating predominantly across the GTHA and within the province of Ontario. Our business has been active in the areas of ground-up development, asset management, and private equity. Our private equity has been all real estate focused, and our developments have ranged everything from condominiums, purpose-built rentals, mixed-use developments, infill and multi-phase developments, and have really been approaching the work that we do through a lens of what is now termed as impact, but thinking about the breadth of capital really at its core, and defining capital beyond just financial capital, and thinking about the social, the environmental, and the cultural capital, and how do we actually create a multiplier effect through the projects that we do, with a really deep belief that we act as stewards, not as owners. And when you're stewarding, you are taking responsibility for the next. And for us, it's been the generational lens, and we see the future generations as our core responsibility in the work that we do.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Can we go from go back a little bit more? Can you go to the beginnings? When I was doing my homework, I figured or I read that your parents started a company about 3 or 4 decades ago.
Yeah,
Maybe
for sure.
not in this exact setup. And from my perspective, based on what I can read, it's almost a Canadian dream story of immigrants coming here and building something from scratch and getting it to a point that I read on your website that you guys have multi-million square feet of asset under management in terms of GFA. So I think that in itself is an interesting story that I'm very curious to learn about.
Yeah, for sure. So family originally from Iran. We immigrated to Canada March 10th, 1981. I was a mature age of 5. Toronto and Canada have been home for many years. Um, Mom and dad both trained as architects in Iran, came here, and very much the immigrant story. Dad's qualifications didn't qualify him to get a job. He ended up going back to university for a third master's degree in architecture, and so he pursued that at U of T. Simultaneously went to school, worked. We knew dad was there because there would be, if anyone who was has been in Toronto a long time, there used to be a cookie shop called Treats. And so dad would leave cookies under our pillows and there'd be stickers under our pillows. So it was a sign that dad had come and gone. And mom was taking care of 2 young kids. I have a younger brother who's 2 years younger than me. He's coming to a country with 2 young kids and starting from scratch. Dad graduated, started working in architecture, didn't love the office aspect of it. He was in Iran, he was working with his brothers in a civil engineering and contracting company. And so his first chance that he had, he took whatever money they had and borrowed money from friends and family and started off with building a house in the Bayview and Shepherd area and started infill housing. It was a spec house that by the time he finished it, the economy had completely bottomed out. And so bit of a reminiscence of where we are today in the cycle. They had the tenacity to keep pushing. And so they've effectively eventually sold that house. In between building it and selling it, he took a job in Houston, Texas. So he was flying back and forth and doing that. But eventually sold the house, bought another, bought 2, bought 4, and built the business in the early 80s as a spec home building business. Given their background in architecture, they had a flair to their projects. And so by the late 80s, they started doing custom home building. And those custom homes began to effectively kept going south. And so at one point they were building at Bayview and Shepherd, then Bayview and York Mills. And by the early to mid 90s, they were building almost all of Brattle Path. And so it really went from building these small 2,500, 3,000 square foot homes to building 25,000, 30,000 square foot homes. And that trajectory sort of continued. I interlay into this, and I joke, but not jokingly. My friends went to summer camp. I went to construction sites. So I grew up working on construction sites, and I feel very fortunate to have had that experience. I eventually went to University of Waterloo. I did my undergrad in architecture, University of Waterloo. I did my work terms back at the family business, and then pretty much began to transition the business. Initially, when mom and dad started, it was design build, and so we had a small design team, and we then began to do sales offices for condo developers. And we had a great partnership with Tridel for a number of years where we were designing and building out their high-end custom units. And then in 2002, took the leap and bought our first development site. And I was midway through a master's degree at that point. Pretty much started working full-time as I started doing my master's degree, and that sort of began our foray into development.
Fantastic. I love that story because in many shapes or forms, I think a good chunk of our audience is going through that journey. They might be at some of the steps of those journeys. I just had a meeting this morning with someone who has been a custom home builder for a number of years, and now they're trying to take it up a notch. And that's one of the things we try to do on this podcast, to create frameworks and create roadmaps for people who've from people who've done that before, and allow others to share it with the others. So going to that first project, I'm not sure how involved you were in that first project. What was the one thing you would have liked to know before entering that project? Or what was the one big takeaway or lesson that, you know what, this was the first project, we learned 1 or 2 things, we should not do that again?
It's a great question. I guess I frame the experiences all as additive. So there's nothing that I wish I'd known. I think part of it is
Perfect.
That you almost need to go through what you do in order to get to where you are. Some of the decisions we made at the time, we were custom home builders, so we chose to bring on a third-party construction manager to oversee it because they had the experience. We brought on a development consultant to work with us because they understood the process and they'd been through it. We made sure we hired the best consultants and we didn't go cheap on the consultants because we could either make the mistakes pretending we were really smart, or we could pay for the intelligence and you see it as an insurance policy. Without sounding arrogant around that, I actually don't think there's anything we would have done differently at that time. We went at it in a very cautionary way. Now, following that, I think there's a lot of things I would have done differently because on subsequent projects. But on this one, I think we went in very much eyes open. But the first one went really well, and I think we almost took that for a bit for granted. And I think sort of subsequent projects, there were lessons learned that I would apply.
So is it fair?
I think that was the peak, and everything else after that, I can tell you about all the mistakes I've made.
Okay, we're going to go there in a second. But is it fair to say on the first one, you had the reps in from the building, the custom houses, and probably, like you mentioned, the fact that you were new and open to hearing it, that really helped you minimize your risk?
Listen, I think that's definitely a fact. And we got lucky because it was the start of the market taking off, right? Over the last 25 years, the market has saved many of us. And I think that's something that I don't take for granted. Like it's not just about being smart, it's about being lucky. And I think I've been 80% lucky and 20% I've made a lot of mistakes around.
Thank you for saying that. Very much appreciate that, because I think these days, many of us and many who are involved in the industry are seeing that and learning that the hard way, just because for a long time the tide was rising and was just lifting all the boats together. And that market situation paid for a lot of bad decisions. And these days, those decisions are very expensive. So now let's change gear. Let's go back and follow that train of thought, if you may. Let's say fast forward how many years do you want to look at? But let's say, what are the 5 mistakes or lessons you learned throughout the way that you wish you had known when you started?
Oh, boy. You're asking me to narrow down from like 1,000 that I've made to narrow down.
Go as wide as you like. Go 50.
No, listen, maybe a bit of a reframing. I think that mistakes often are anchored around a negative connotation. And I think part of all of this and the perspective that I bring to all of this is that we frame all of our pursuits as one of growth. More often than not, given the construct we live in, success is anchored to a financial paradigm, yet true growth is about personal trajectory and personal journey. And so my greatest growth has come from the lessons I've had from the things that have gone wrong. Are they mistakes, or were they creating the opportunity for the growth? So I think there's a real important framing. And in particular, given the market context, I share this with a lot of friends who might be listening, who are feeling like, oh my God, I can't believe I made this mistake and that mistake. Everything feels like it's been going wrong for a lot of us in the industry. And I think it's just part of the market dynamics of it. So I think I would just frame that. There is nothing more important than time. And I think framing time relative to the journey is really important. And in that, I would say that one of my big lessons has been, how do you actually time such that the choices you make are at a pace that is accelerating you forward? But there's a difference between accelerating you forward versus tipping you over the edge. No different than driving a car. You can go fast, but it's going fast that if something happens, you go out of control. And so I think one of my big lessons has been understanding pace. And what pace does is that pace then, in my respect to our industry, correlates to scale. And so how much do you want to take on, when and how, I think is a really important lesson that I've garnered, and really take that as one big sort of bucket, is the correlation of time and scale. And I think that's really important. The second thing I would talk about is around establishing first principles. I have consistently throughout my entire career run a business that has been anchored around a set of core principles and a set of core values. And I would say that the one principle that is underpinning all of it are the choices that you make that anchor financial principles and becoming unwavering about your financial principles. And so it's very easy when times are good to frame everything as an investment. But I think being able to understand the framing of the investment against a set of core principles that are unwavering becomes really important. And I would say one example that I would use is, we had a great opportunity around buying an asset. I've generally run our portfolio at 50% leverage. I've never taken more than 50% leverage. And in development, many people would take an A piece, a B piece, a C piece. They would get it up to 95% leverage. They put in 5% equity, and they would target a 10 times multiple on 5% equity. We never did that. To me, it was like, if you can't own it with 50% leverage, you can't own it. I decided we had a great opportunity around one deal. We decided to take 70% leverage. And that became my biggest challenge and problem over the last number of years. And I broke my own principle of never going above 50% leverage. And when I look back in that moment of time, would I have likely made the same decision? I would have, with everything that I knew then and at that point. But the premise of those principles is that even when something looks really good, you can't cross those principles, because I think that's where you can set yourself up. So my second point being, establish your financial principles and don't let them waver. The third thing, which I think has been a really big lesson, and this is very personal, is you can have a why around your business strategy, but having a very clear articulated why around your strategy. And being clear on your personal strategy, I think, is really important, because that personal strategy is actually where your intellect can fool you. And for anyone who often gets into this business, there is an intellectual sort of discourse that comes into play, and our intellect is incredibly great at fooling ourselves. And there's nothing that can trick the ego better than the intellect can, and vice versa. So that would be really the third lesson: is how do you clearly articulate your own personal why? If you want to get rich, I think that just needs to be clear. That's like, you can't fool yourself and say, I'm doing this for the greater good and that and the rest. And it really then, all of this ties back to my first statement around the fact that it is about a personal journey, and going through these processes is about the great growth that one achieves as an individual, as a soul, as a mind, as an intellect. And so I would use those three buckets as the big lessons learned at a macro level.
I very much appreciate your transparency and your willingness to share those things. So be careful about your timing and scaling, have your financial principles, and be clear on your personal why. I want to dive a little bit more into those just to make sure I get them right. And so under scaling, because this is a very common conversation that I've heard come up multiple times, and that the way I understand it is that if you have been doing a custom house or 10 of them per year, probably the next best step for you is not to start doing a 30-story, 400-unit building. And like you said, start leveraging and maybe go to a 6-story, maybe do a 16-story, and then step up. Is that the same realm of scaling that you're thinking, or am I getting it wrong?
Listen, I think scaling is a correlation between time and resources. I think it's about attention span. I think it's about focus, and choose to go wide and thin or narrow and deep. I think it's the intentionality. And then it ties back to the two other things I spoke about. So I don't think any of these things can be talked about in a silo, but it's about a system. So it's about the system you're defining for yourself. And so the system that you define for yourself is predicated around those three core principles. If you're going to go from building 10 homes to building a 300-unit building, it's like someone who has been making ham and cheese sandwiches, and now they want to serve a 7-course haute cuisine meal, right? So if you're going to make that leap, how are you making the leap? So it's not a question of should you or shouldn't you, but I think there's an inherent understanding that the leap from one to the next is not because your ego says, I can do this because I've done this, but to understand that it's a completely different thing. And it's not that you can't do it, but you just have to go into it eyes wide open. So I think it's understanding what the transition means versus making the transition. And if the transition is because you think you're smart, that's a pretty huge risk profile. But if the transition is, here's an opportunity, I'm going to gather the right resources and the right people and the right around me, then that's a different thing. I would also say that very often you might see it and say, oh, wow, look at all the money I can make. I think the more important question is how much money can I lose? And so if you frame everything on not the potential of what can be, but the possibility of how much you can lose, it reframes it. And then thirdly, I think what becomes really important in these conversations is around what am I willing to give up for success? Okay? Because you might have to say, you know what, I'm going to take on this 300 unit building. I'm going to give away 50% of the profit to someone who's done this already and bring them on as a partner. Are you giving away 50% of the profit, or are you saving the 50% of profit or are you saving 100% of your equity that you could lose? So I think a lot of these things are around the framings.
I appreciated what you said. Reminds me of something James Clear says in his Atomic Habit books, which is at the start line of a 100-meter race, everyone wants to get the gold medal, but they don't go just because they have the goal, they don't get it. They fall back on the systems and support and practices and routines that they've had throughout the years to get them to that point. Speaking of systems and practices, so if you were to talk to your younger version or someone who is in that shoes and they're going from that, I again go back to the example of 10 custom houses per year, now one step up the game. What are the 1, 2, 3 key processes or systems that you think you should have in place to make sure that you are as much as possible ready to make that leap?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Payam here. Just really quick, here's what we've recently done. We've gone through our conversations that we've had so far on the podcast and many other offline conversations with developers, planners, architects, and we've created an assessment. It's called Development Readiness Assessment. It's free, it takes less than 5 minutes to complete, and once you complete it, you'll receive a structured feedback across 6 core areas that consistently show up in successful development projects. Projects don't fail because people lack ambition. They typically fail because risks go underestimated, assumptions go unchecked, or the project quietly outgrows the team behind it. That's exactly why I created this assessment. If this is your first time starting the project, a mid-rise, or even a multiplex, this assessment will give you clarity on your blind spots and where the risks lie. Check the show notes for the link to the assessment or go to developmentreadinessassessment.com, developmentreadinessassessment.com. Thank you and good luck.
The single biggest thing is having a very clear risk matrix. Understanding what are the risks that you're assuming and how are you tracking your risks against every single decision that you're making. So understanding sort of a clear risk matrix is probably the first thing I would say, because that then begins to set out exactly where things can go wrong. So the clarity of that risk matrix, I think, is really important.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Are you talking about, okay, am I going to lose? Is the risk in terms of how much I'm willing to sell this for, like per square foot price?
All of the different things. So for example, what is the risk around schedule? What is the risk around entitlements? What is the risk around interest rates? What is the risk around... So there's some core fundamental risks around every single development project, depending on where you start in the cycle, where you are in terms of the acquisition, everything from your land cost, your carrying cost, your entitlement risk, your financing risk, your equity risk. I just think needing to understand all of those different risk components is fundamental, because it's almost like you think of it as an equalizer, right? When one risk goes up, another one comes down, but they're constantly moving. So being able to have a very clear risk matrix where you're constantly tracking where your risk is at any moment in a project, to me, is fundamental. Second is the people around you, right? Who's your team? Like I always have had incredible success of putting people that are a lot smarter than me around my tables. And I think if you can manage people who are smarter than you are in what they do, I think that's a huge piece. None of these projects gets done by a person. The greatest success comes around the team. And so how do you build the strongest team? And then thirdly, I would just, again, it's about really understanding the financial framework, your capital stack, and understanding your capital stack, not at the beginning of the project, but in its most dire sort of moments. I would say every developer is very wealthy on an Excel spreadsheet, and then you put all of it at risk the moment you put a shovel in the ground, and everything is at the risk of
Very
being
true.
lost. And
Very
just
true.
understanding the capital stack of your project over project lifecycle is critical.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to start talking about tasks as a whole a little bit. Tasks impact. So when I was doing a little bit of my research, TAS is a leader in impact real estate. Can you open that up a little bit for us? What does that mean? Impact real estate.
Yeah, for sure. So I started off the top, so talking about the fact that we look at capital across the various segments. We define our impact through our impact framework, where we've been measuring for sustainability, social equity, affordability, culture, and environment. And so we're tracking everything by numbers. And I think that's a really important element. When people talk about impact, it's about measurement, and no different than a financial report card. A impact report card is critical. If you can't measure it, then it's not real. I'm a big believer of that. This has been an incremental process for us. It's been through experience as we've advanced project to project. We've layered on different things, and we've been measuring everything. And that's the real important thing. I think our last impact report had us measuring about 95 different outcomes across our portfolio and the way that we look at it. Impact, we say, impact isn't a strategy, it's just what we do. And so, again, it's really thinking about the role that real estate has in the broadest of senses. And without a question, first and foremost, it's financial returns. If you do not have financial returns, none of the other things come to play. And so we are stewards of financial capital for our investors. And so first and foremost, our responsibility is towards financial capital. But we measure the other elements as well, because you have to be thinking about the correlation of the parts. And I think that's really what our impact approach does, is it considers how the different parts are correlated together. And so we measure the total outcomes of what we do in considering the choices we make.
And like I read that you are trying to align purpose and profit. Going back to what you were just saying a few minutes ago about the why, is that the why?
100%. Like, to me, they go hand in hand. If it's not we chose to pursue impact because it was the right business decision. So we never looked at it as altruistic. It's, to me, it's how we do business, and it gave us an advantage. We invested in the way that we do this as a commitment to driving a capital return out of it, and being able to demonstrate that, if you make the choices from the outset, you can actually lever it to drive financial returns. And so for us, our impact strategy wasn't an altruistic strategy. It was a financial strategy to drive better returns for our capital.
So do you think that for someone who is, again, I go to the profile of the person that we were talking about, who is someone who's just trying to step up their game or getting in your shoes for the first time early on in the journey, is that something they start from day one, or do you need to get to a critical mass of capital and backing for you to be able to start incorporating that into your mission, vision, and why?
I think you need to have the principles of your mission and why right out of the gate. But do I think you should have an impact report out of the gate? I think with the advent of the technology available to us today and the way that things are done, I think it's completely possible in a way that it wasn't possible even 3 or 5 years ago. I think being able to articulate what your objectives are, really, I think you have to go back to a fundamental principle. Real estate needs to be seen through in 10-year investment cycles. Right? So if you're investing and your core objective is to make money and get on, be honest with yourself. If your objective is to do more than just make money, then you ask yourself, what else do I want to do? And you have to measure. I actually don't think it's, we called it impact at a time because we needed something to call it, but it's just what we've been doing.
So it's a byproduct of your way of doing business.
It's a byproduct of our 100%. It's a great way of framing it. It is absolutely a byproduct of what we've done. And it's something that I believed in. And so we invested in it. And that's something that I'm proud of, the fact that we led the charge. And I've always believed, and we are very locally sensitive, but we lead our leadership through a global mindset. We created probably one of the most comprehensive global frameworks around impact investing for real estate. And that's not what we believe. It's what we've been told by our European colleagues and investors, and what we've been told by many, that we were at the forefront of this work. But we're at the forefront because we invested time and resources to it. You can be at the forefront of anything if you invest time and resources at it. We didn't do anything special. We just made a decision as to where you want to spend our money. You spend your money, you get the results.
And I'm very happy to see this movement. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of being exposed to that firsthand with one of our clients, Windmill Developments, which they have their own internal set of matrix. And it's painful sometimes to make it happen, to make sure you stand by what you claim to believe in. And sometimes it's not the cheapest decisions to make, but no different than what you said. Like these are long-term decisions that you make because you believe in something. And just for context, for our listeners who are not necessarily familiar with this verbiage or this vocabulary, I just want to put this context. So I read in your report that you're targeting net zero operating certification in some of your buildings, or you're targeting 10% affordability target throughout your portfolio, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe elaborate and maybe 2 or 3 key objectives of your impact for those of our listeners who are not familiar with the concept.
Yeah. So for example, when we design our buildings, so when you're looking at carbon measurement, there's 2 elements of carbon measurement. There's embedded carbon and there's operating carbon. Embedded carbon is the carbon that goes into building the buildings, whereas operating carbon is the systems and the operations of the building after they've been completed. It is impossible to get your building to carbon zero for embedded carbon. When you build something, inherently it has carbon in it. Our view has been around carbon reduction through design and core design principles. So how do you design the most efficient structure? How do you reduce rebar? How do you think about the kinds of the full carbon cycle of products and materials going into your building? So that's the embedded carbon side. So we've done a lot of work in terms of thinking of how do we go through carbon reduction. The second part of it is about making the choices around your building systems to get them to carbon neutral or carbon positive as it relates to operating. That's the mechanical systems you put in, the flows in your water systems. It's looking at the types of insulation that you use, your building envelope, and how those things are designed. And so we're just very intentional in how we design those elements in our buildings. And so it's embedded into our specs. It's embedded into our subcontract agreements. Now, we've been at the forefront of waste reduction and demolition. We've reduced close to 95% in terms of carbon waste reduction and repurposing and reusing. We've embedded those into the way that we do our tenders and do our tendering for our subcontractors. So it's very much of a systems-based approach to reducing carbon. And so our impact report and our impact strategy measures for all of those types of things. On the social impact side, we have been very deliberate on how we run our projects from inception. So we haven't been to LPAT or OMB in 15 years, and we've had millions of square feet approved. And that has to do with the level of engagement that we have with our various stakeholders from the onset of any project. We don't wait for a mandatory planning community meeting. We run multitudes of community meetings beforehand. And we work with communities to learn from them. I always say every time we go into a new neighborhood, we engage with the community like being at a dinner party. They are the host, we are the guest. We want to be invited back for the next dinner. And you're there not to teach, you're there to learn. And I think that's an overarching element of our business model, is that we lead with curiosity because we're there to learn. And we believe in terms of the value of learning along the process. And so that really does frame out the way that we think about our social impact. And then that ties into the kinds of groups we work with, from the big proponents of disability and working with groups with disability. We're big proponents of working with Indigenous communities. We developed a reconciliation action plan, which is regarded as one of the leading sort of RAPs in Canada. But all of it is around deep engagement with an authentic view to curiosity and learning. And so that has been a significant part of it for us in terms of how we've done that. So again, then the report lays all these things out, and we have multiple examples of how we do it.
And I think, like you said, all of it stems from the long-term view, and that the role that you guys have envisioned for your investment purposes. It's not just the money, it's not just the ROI versus maybe a more long-term vision and creating an impact, for lack of a better word. I want to go to you're part of a whole bunch of nonprofit organizations. You do nonprofit boards. You're on nonprofit boards.
Yeah.
What do you see if we have someone listening from a nonprofit, which I think we have a few of them, and they want to take away some things or some lessons in terms of effectiveness, being more efficient with their resources? I believe you used the word stewardship. What are some takeaways or key lessons that they could use?
Most successful nonprofits I've been at have been have really to a lens of leadership and a clear articulation of leadership. And leadership has been two-pronged. It's been either the executive directors or the CEOs of the organization, coupled with a very strong board. Non-for-profits have a constant challenge of funding. And the hardest thing to fund is your intellectual base, and a strong board can be a huge resource. And the quality of a board, I think, is foundational to the success of a non-for-profit. To anyone who is running a non-for-profit, I think being very clear and understanding that your board is your partner and the most valuable partner that you have, and seeing your board as a part of your success is fundamental. The second piece, which I would almost say overrides the first piece, but is directly correlated, is governance. The success of any organization is predicated on governance. The foundation for innovation is governance. And non-for-profits are at the forefront of innovation because they're solving for some of our greatest challenges. And too often people see governance as a constraint, or they see governance as a block or a barrier. Governance to me is the magic that unlocks innovation, because it provides you a framework to protect you, to then allow you to take those big leaps. And so governance to me would be the number one thing. And for anyone who is an executive director or a lead of a non-for-profit, your number one job is fundraising. So if anyone who's leading a non-for-profit organization, if you think that fundraising is what your fundraising committee does, it's completely wrong. You as the CEO or the executive director need to be at the forefront of that, and need to be articulate and clear enough as to the vision of the organization to be able to get the capital to come behind you. So those are the three things I would frame.
Fantastic. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about the current situation that we are in as a country, as a market, as an industry. We all can hear it multiple times a day, probably, in terms of low number of sales for new projects and a record number of low starts for construction projects, and you name it: housing crisis, affordability crisis, tariffs, all the fun stuff that goes with all of that. Mm-hmm. What's your read on the current situation? And then with that read, we'll transition into what's coming up next.
Can I use profanities?
By all means.
It's really shit. I can keep going with the profanities if you really want me to go. So we are at the heart of a paradigm shift. And it's not a paradigm shift around real estate. It's a paradigm shift at the most macro levels as it relates to political constructs, as it relates to political sentiment, as it relates to social sentiment, as it relates to economic sentiment. We are seeing the manifestation of the choices made over the last 20 years coming to roost, and we're seeing the downside effects of those. When you go through a paradigm shift, systems become reset. And as systems are getting reset, the most challenging part of any system reset are the social and cultural norms that become ingrained in the way that people think. And so in the midst of a paradigm reset, what you're effectively doing is breaking apart all of the things that had become normative for society. And so it just feels like everything is crumbling. In our view, it's what a phoenix process is around. We're going through a phoenix process right now, and we're at the stage of the thing burning before a rebirth. It's very hard when you're in the midst of a paradigm shift or a phoenix process to believe that there's hope on the other side. But the reality is that nothing is stagnant and everything cycles. It is the magic of nature. I read a beautiful Japanese proverb that even trees lose their leaves. And so I think it's the reality of being in the midst of a massive paradigm shift or a phoenix burning. And so the social or cultural reference is shit, the real element of it is opportunity. And so we're going through a massive opportunity reset in the current time.
Okay, so if I take that and I ask you to do the impossible, fast forward 5 years for us as an industry, as an economy, and for TAS as a company, what do you see?
I don't know is my real answer. And I think that we try to frame these conversations of what the future looks like to satiate our fears of the unknown. And I actually think it's not a time of doing, it's a time of observing. And so when we begin to forecast, what we're doing is that we're trying to hold on to how we control an outcome. Yet I think that in these times, it's not time to hold on, it's time to let go and to be an observer. And I say that in the context of someone who's managing receiverships, debt, financial crises, all the rest. So this isn't as though I'm not sitting here on the plinth of a billionaire who has all the money and doesn't care. So the challenges are just underneath my nostril. So I'm trying to stay afloat like many of us are in the industry. So I want to be very clear that this isn't coming from a lens of financial privilege. But I think what becomes most challenging in these times is the fear of the unknown. And so we've made the decision as an organization to sell the assets that we have. We've made the decision to take losses if we need to take losses, and to effectively unconstrain ourselves from the system that was. And so we've made the hard decision to take a lot of losses. But I do believe that in order to transition, you need to make a decision. The most challenging aspect of being in these circumstances is not being able to make a choice, being so afraid of the unknown that on the one hand, you're terrified of what's ahead, but on the other hand, you're holding on to what the past was. And so, unfortunately, I don't have any perspective on what the future is. What I do know is that to be present in this in time is the most important thing. And in order to be present, it's about making the choices to move on.
Again, I appreciate your honesty and transparency. Thank you for sharing that. And you did touch on something that you really got me thinking, because I come from an operation mind that we need to be doing. And many years ago, I committed myself to this way of thinking that I think it was a book from Andy Grove that was like, there are certain key elements that are within your control, and you have the levers, and just focus on the one that you can control and work with
100%.
them to keep moving forward. But I guess what I'm hearing also from you here is that there's so much turbulence in the path of, if we're flying a plane per se, if there's so much turbulence and there was so many things that your too much action, your old routine of actions might actually get you into more trouble than waiting for the coast to clear, hopefully within some reasonable parameters of not losing everything you have pretty much, and giving yourself a time to think. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, for sure. Listen, it's not a matter of sitting back and not doing anything. But I'm busier than I've ever been. But I'm busy moving forward. I'm not busy holding on, if there's what I would describe it as. And I'm not afraid of what next is. Yeah, we're selling assets. I'm going to have, as you said, we were at our peak. We had about 7 million square feet of development in our portfolio. We own some very key sites, but everything is worth a fraction of what it was. Now, even though we only had 50% leverage, things are worth the debt value.
Yeah, that much. Yeah.
It's just the time of the cycle that we're in. And I guess the premise of it is, how do you position yourself not to operate out of a place of fear?
Right.
And I think, to me, that element of letting go or being present is not one of sitting back and not doing anything. It's a question of what are you focused on doing?
Gotcha. That's a moment of reflection. So with that said, we ask our guests on this podcast a magic wand question. If we were to give you a magic wand and ask you to make one wish, in terms of what could help turn our current situation, as you put it, toward improvement, toward making things better? It could be change in law or regulation or mindset, or like you said, paradigm shifts. Pick one, make a wish, and let us know what that wish is, please.
It's a great question. I think I would wish for everyone to care. And the reason I use the term care is because the housing industry, the real estate industry, is so multifaceted and involves so many stakeholders that the only way we can move forward is for everyone to realize that no one can do it on their own. And the moment you begin to care,
Very true.
you begin to actually not make it about yourself, and you make it about everyone else. And it's only when it's about everyone else and everyone behaves as though it's about everyone else that everyone can move forward.
Interesting. Thank you very much. With that being said, and trying to not wrap this up on a doom and gloom mood, are there any trends in the industry that you see that outside of our exact moment in time that warms your heart a little bit and say, you know what, this is a good trend, maybe in 5 years or maybe in 10 years, we're going to see good benefits from it? Is there anything
absolutely.
like that?
I think the magic of a crisis is that it spurs innovation and new thinking. And I would say every developer is smart when times are good and a philosopher when times are challenging.
It's true.
What am I excited about? I look at the fact that we're beginning to see elements of people caring. And at the heart of community is care. And I think that we're beginning to see people giving a lot more value to community and the communities that they're part of. You begin to see new models emerging. I've recently gotten to know Ron Lovett quite well, who's based out of Halifax and runs a platform called Vida. And the work that they're doing is extraordinary around preserving affordable housing by enabling communities within them to own them and run them. You mentioned the work that you're doing with Jonathan and Runma. I think they're just another great organization who's just so thoughtful about the way that they're doing their work. That there's a huge opportunity on reimagining the integration of seniors into our society. And how do we think about communities and homesteads? And how do we think about rural communities? We're doing quite a bit of work in rural communities right now and thinking about how do we reimagine integration of a broad sense of demographics within new community constructs, and how does everyone help each other? And so I think at a time where we pursued efficiency by creating silos, we're now realizing that the greatest opportunity is around communities by breaking down those silos. And I think if there's anything that I would say is going to be emergent out of the Phoenix burning, is the redefinition of the value of our communities and how we come together to care about how we think of our society into the future.
I love that we are all in this together. If there's anything that has become very clear in the past year or two, is that we're all in this together.
100%.
It's not, and that's one of the things we've also been trying to promote here in this podcast or other work that we do, is that we don't fight with the cities. We don't have, I don't believe anyone in this city or municipality, because that's sometimes the sentiment that is, sometimes you get the frustration that comes out like that. And at the end of the day,
I always sort of say, we always have this with our teams. Don't ever forget, when you're dealing with a municipality, their hands are tied.
100%.
We are the ones who are entrepreneurs and can make a decision and move forward. They're not. And so our job is to enable them. Their job is not to enable us. Right? And so when you care, when you see the person across the table as truly your partner, your job is to enable what they need to do. And when you show up with that care, you begin to form partnerships. It's why we haven't been to El Paso or OMB for 15 years, is because we show up caring.
That must be some sort of record, by the way. The amount of work that you guys do and not having to do that, because I know a lot of people out there, unfortunately, that's their general mode of operation.
No, so it probably is a record, and I think it's something that we're proud of, but it's because it goes back to those core principles. It goes back to the fact that we don't see ourselves as the one on top of the pyramid. I believe in horizontal structures where the people you work with stand side by next with you and you hold hands together and you move forward. It's very different than when you think of hierarchies.
Thank you very much, Mazyar. This has been a lot of fun. Is there anything that I haven't asked you, or do you have any thoughts that you want to share with our audience before we wrap this up?
I think in the context of caring and doing this together, I just really appreciate the leadership you're showing in putting the effort to do this podcast. I think it's a great example of how we can all learn together. And I just thank you for giving me the time. I find I learn more about my own thoughts in these contexts, and I really appreciate you inviting me here.
Thank you very much for saying that. And frankly, there was a point in time I got tired of just venting and hearing all the complaints and knowing about the issues. And we said, let's try and be part of the solution. And this is our attempt at this is our attempt of being part of the solution to the extent that we can these days. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here. And I'm really hoping that in a year or two, we can have a second part of this conversation where the situation is not as shitty as it is today. And we might have better vibes, let's put it this way, and we go from there.
Well, we'll talk about the phoenix that has risen.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, Mazyar.
Thank you.
Just one last thing before you leave, please make sure to visit our website. We have put together a whole bunch of different resources that you can download for free from our website. These include checklists, manuals, and also access to previous webinars. In case you have missed any of our previous webinars, you can go there, get the replay link, download the slides, and benefit from all these free resources that we've gathered on the website. Please make sure to visit. Thank you.